The signal lasted 11 seconds. She counted them twice alone. That detail matters, not the frequency, not the compression architecture, not what was inside it. The counting. Because Orvith Caln was the kind of person who, when something unprecedented dropped into her monitoring queue at 4 in the morning, did not reach for the comm unit or the alarm panel or anyone else on the station. She reached instead for precision. She counted. Then she counted again to make sure the first count was right. Inside the Meridian Assembly Chamber, 28,000 seats were filled, and every one of them was watching her. The chamber was enormous in the specific way of things built by committee across a very long time. Layers of architecture from a dozen different species pressed together into something that had stopped being designed and started being accumulated. The acoustic engineering was extraordinary. A whisper at the speaker's platform reached the back row without amplification, which meant that when Orvith stood at that platform with her thermos in one hand and a data chip in the other, every click of the first coordinator's secondary mandibles was audible too. The clicking had been going on for 6 hours. Orvith set the data chip into the display port. The chamber's screens lit up. Earth's solar system, mapped in coordinates she had decoded herself, appeared on every display surface simultaneously. The first coordinator of the Varethi founding compact rose from the senior block table. Pale exoskeletal plating. 4 eye stalks orienting independently, each fixing on a different part of the room. The ceremonial sash across the secondary arms indicated 400 years of unbroken block seniority, which, in a chamber this old, was considered relatively recent. "You do not understand," said First Coordinator Osuvith Drow in a register that sounded like gravel being sorted slowly, "the complexity of what you are proposing." 28,000 witnesses. Orvith looked at Drow across the chamber floor. She thought about a cold archive corridor. She thought about a personal note written by someone 11,000 years dead, filed correctly, acted on never. She thought about 6 worlds currently transmitting signals into space on frequencies nobody had told them to use. She counted to 9 before she answered. She always counted. "With respect," said Orvith Caln, "I think we understand it very well." She paused 1 breath. "Better than you would prefer. What happens next, stay with me on this one. Because what came after that sentence was not what anyone in that chamber expected, and it is not, if I am being honest with you, what Orvith herself expected either. 9 months earlier, Relay Outpost Castle smelled like recycled air, and something the engineers had collectively decided to call industrious mildew. The name was accurate. The smell was the specific product of 3 pressurized rings, a crew of 11, and a ventilation system that worked correctly in the sense that everyone was still breathing, but which had never quite managed to cycle out the particular quality of air that develops when human beings have been working in an enclosed space for a significant period of time. Orvith had stopped noticing it somewhere around month 3. She noticed it again briefly on the mornings when the ventilation ran its weekly full-cycle flush, and then it returned, and she stopped noticing it again. The viewport in the signal bay faced directly away from the sun. This meant the stars were always in it. At 4 in the morning on a Tuesday that Castle Station recorded as day 214 of their posting, Orvith was alone in the signal bay with a thermos of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and a mechanical pencil tucked behind her left ear. She used a stylus for actual work. The pencil was something else. She had solved the calibration problem that got her posted to Castle in the first place on the back of a paper napkin with that pencil, and some habits are harder to break than bureaucracies, so she kept it there. She reached for it occasionally without thinking. She almost never used it. The monitoring array in front of her was running a passive sweep across 17 frequency bands. The same sweep it ran every 6 hours. The same sweep that had returned nothing worth reporting for 8 months and 4 days. Something about that particular Tuesday felt different. Or rather, it didn't. It felt exactly the same. That was the wrong detail. The array pinged. Not loudly. Not with any of the escalating alerts that the system was designed to produce for genuine anomalies. A single quiet ping on a frequency that Orvith had added to the sweep herself 18 months before the posting, for reasons that she had written up in a paper that received 11 reads total, 8 of which were her own follow-up checks. She leaned forward. The signal lasted 11 seconds. She counted them twice. Then it stopped. She sat very still for a moment. The cold coffee was in her left hand. She set it down. The pencil was behind her ear. She left it there. She looked at the readout on the screen in front of her, the compression architecture, the frequency band, the structural pattern in the pulse, and she recognized what she was looking at in the same way you recognize a word in a language you have been teaching yourself for 3 years in private. Not fluently, not immediately, but with a certainty that settled into the chest before the brain caught up. This was not random noise. Random noise does not have structure. Random noise does not repeat internal patterns at precise intervals. Random noise does not carry what she could only describe. even to herself at 4 in the morning in a cold signal bay as grammar. She did not wake anyone's. She knew that sounded strange. She had been in signal work long enough to know that the moment you share a discovery, the discovery starts belonging to the process. There are committee meetings. There are verification protocols. There is a form and then a form to verify the first form and then a waiting period while both forms are reviewed by someone who did not witness the thing being documented. Orvith had nothing against verification protocols. She believed in them generally. But she wanted 1 hour with this first, just one, before it became a procedure. She ran every filter she had. It took 38 minutes to crack the outer encoding layer, using a translation framework she had developed over 2 years and published in the paper nobody read. The framework was built on a theory that any two civilizations capable of interstellar communication would share certain mathematical constants, and that those constants could serve as a structural skeleton key for initial decoding. Her supervisor had called this imaginative. The peer reviewers had called it unprovable. 38 minutes. Inside the encoding was a document. Dry, bureaucratic, administrative in the specific way of institutions that have been operating long enough that efficiency has been optimized out of them entirely. A registry. A list of registered sapient civilizations in this region of the galaxy, organized by species name, home system coordinates, current classification, legal standing under something called the Foundation Charter of the Meridian Assembly, and observation notes. 219 entries. Earth's solar system was entry number 112. Orvith read it 3 times, not because she did not understand it the first time. She understood it the first time. She read it 3 times because some information requires a running start. The entry read, Sol System, 3rd planet, carbon substrate biosphere, per-contact observation status, passive monitoring only, contact prohibited under Foundation Charter, Section 9, Paragraph 6, classification Pre-Sapient. She set down the stylus. She picked up the cold coffee by mistake, realized it was cold, set it down again. She looked at the screen. Pre-Sapient. The word was doing something to her that she did not immediately have a name for. It was not anger, she was certain of that. Anger felt like heat, and this was not hot. It was the specific cold clarity of a person who has just understood the exact dimensions of a problem and is already below the level of conscious thought beginning to solve it. The entry was not new. The observation notes attached predated the current Assembly Charter's formatting conventions, which meant the file on Earth's solar system was older than the charter currently governing it. This was not a data entry mistake. It was a policy. She pulled out the notepad from the drawer beside the console. Spiral-bound college ruled, purchased from the supply kiosk at Castle. She used paper when the signals got strange because screens updated and paper did not. What you wrote on paper stayed exactly as wrong or exactly as right as the moment you wrote it. No revision, no automatic sync. I pulled out the notepad, she said later to people who asked her to reconstruct the sequence. Paper, not screen, because some signals deserve to be written down in something that can't be edited later. She wrote down the clause number. Section 9, Paragraph 6. The Foundation Charter of the Meridian Assembly. Then she wrote down the date in 3 formats, cross-referenced against the calendar systems embedded in the registry document she had just decoded. Then she wrote down a question that she did not have an answer to yet. Who decided this and when? She did not wake the crew. She had 3 options, and she worked through them in the same flat methodical way she worked through every problem. Option 1, log the signal, report it through official channels, wait for the committee. 6 months minimum before anything happened, possibly longer. The committee would have subcommittees. Option 2, wake the crew now. Chaos. Leaks. Somebody would contact a journalist or family or both. The story would become about the station, about the crew, about 12 humans having feelings in space, and the actual content of the registry would get buried in the noise. Option 3. She looked at the neutrino pulse modulator. Seleth had built it over 14 months and listed it in the station manifest as experimental signal research, which was true in the way that most things Seleth described as experiments were true, accurate in category, catastrophically optimistic in scope. Neutrinos traveled at nearly the speed of light. They passed through matter as if it was not there. And if you were very patient and very precise about how you modulated the beam, they could carry structured data. No human agency had ever successfully used one for communication at meaningful distance. Seleth had managed it twice, over short distances, with error rates that even he described as probably too high for anything important. She spent the next 4 hours building a reply. It was short. She identified Earth by coordinates and by date in 3 calendar systems she had just decoded. She noted the classification discrepancy. She requested clarification of methodology. She signed it with her own name. I signed it because I wanted there to be a record, she said later, not of the signal, of who sent it. She sent the reply at 8:47 station time. Then she made fresh coffee. Then she went and knocked on Ivan Brawl's door and stood in the corridor when it opened and said quietly that something had happened and she needed Ivan to not mention it to anyone for the next 43 hours. And Ivan, who had been the station medic for 2 years and had learned what Orvith's quiet voice meant, said nothing at all and simply went and made a second cup of coffee and left it on the console beside the first one. That was Ivan's way of processing things on behalf of other people. 43 hours. The proximity alarms went off at 6:12 on Thursday morning, all of them simultaneously, which was a thing that had not happened before in the 8-month posting history of Relay Outpost Castle. Orvith was eating toast in the galley when the alarm sounded. She set the toast down on the counter. She did not take it with her. She walked, not ran, but quickly to the observation deck and looked through the reinforced viewport. The ship was large. Large in the way that mountains were large. Large in the way that made some part of the brain that was responsible for scale assessment quietly refuse to process the data and request that a different department handle it. It was dark and geometric, and it moved through space the way a stone moved through air, as though the space itself was a minor inconvenience it had long since stopped acknowledging. It stopped approximately 40,000 kilometers from Castle Station. Then it sent a signal. Orvith was already at her console. The signal was on the same frequency, using the same compression architecture, decoded by the same framework. The translation took 9 minutes this time because her hands were not quite steady and she kept checking the output twice. The message read, "We received your transmission. You have made an administrative error. Please stand by for correction." She looked at that message for a very long time. Seleth Orn appeared in the doorway behind her. He was in his work clothes, which meant he had been running diagnostics on something, which was what Seleth did when he could not sleep, which was most nights. He looked at her screen. He looked at her face. He looked back at the screen. "Orvith," he said. "Oh yes. Is that an alien ship?" "Oh yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are we going to do?" She had already drafted the reply. She turned back to the console and looked at what she had written and decided it was correct and sent it. "No administrative error has been made. Please clarify the nature of your intended correction." "We're going to wait," she said. "And we're going to have coffee, real coffee, not the emergency rations. I think this is going to be a long conversation." It was Seleth who retrieved the good beans from the supply cabinet. He set the pot going without being asked. This was, Orvith reflected, the reason she had requested him specifically for this posting. The ship did not respond immediately. It sat at 40,000 kilometers and did nothing that the station's sensors could detect. This was more unsettling in some ways than if it had done something. A ship that size doing nothing at that distance had a specific quality. Orvith catalogued it in the notepad, 40,000 kilometers, no visible energy signature, no movement. Duration, 6 hours, 12 minutes before next event. She underlined the duration. Then she added a note below it. "I have been in this situation for 6 hours and 12 minutes longer than any other human being in recorded history. I am not sure how to feel about that. Moving on." Seleth read the note over her shoulder and said nothing, which was correct. The shuttle came on Thursday evening. It did not dock. It simply was docked, the way a key is simply in a lock, bypassing the airlock through a mechanism that Orvith's sensor logs recorded as a gap in the data rather than an event. One moment the station showed no attached vessel. The next moment it did. One figure stepped out into the station's transit corridor. Tall, pale blue-gray, in the specific way of things that had spent no meaningful time near a star. Bilaterally framed but with 4 arms, 2 of which were folded behind the figure's back in a posture that Orvith later learned indicated bureaucratic authority, which meant the figure had been in that posture before disembarking and had consciously maintained it for the walk down the corridor. Gold compound eyes, large, faceted, the kind that seemed to be processing several things simultaneously while finding none of them particularly urgent. The translation unit was the size of a briefcase. It hummed at a frequency Orvith felt in her back teeth before she heard it in the room. "This interaction," said the translation unit, in a voice that was clearly generated rather than produced, "is informal. No formal recognition of sapient status is implied by the act of communication. The Meridian Assembly acknowledges receipt of the signal from the entity self-identified as Orvith Caln of Earth." Orvith looked at the figure. The figure looked at her with the specific quality of someone reading a letter that had arrived at the wrong address and was deciding what to do about it. "Thank you for coming in person," Orvith said. "Can I offer you anything? We have coffee." Ivan in the doorway behind her made a quiet noise. The figure's name in translation resolved to something like Conclave Envoy Adjudicator Primary Delegate Vesson Drull. Orvith decided to use Drull. Drull did not object. Drull said, "This station is in violation of Foundation Charter, Section 9, Paragraph 6. All space-based activity originating from the third planet of the Sol system is required to cease pending review. Which review process are you referring to? Orvith said. Droll's translation unit hummed before answering. The standard review process for pre-sapient worlds that have made unauthorized contact. We have made authorized contact, Orvith said. We are sapient. We received your census document and replied to it. That reply constitutes first contact under your own charter, Article 2, Clause 9, which states that any world capable of initiating structured communication on a designated frequency is eligible to request sapient classification review. A pause. The translation unit's hum shifted register slightly, which Orvith filed in the notepad under. Possible tell, investigate later. Droll said Clause 9 pertains to communication via standard interstellar relay. You used a neutrino pulse system. That method is not listed in the charter. Correct, Orvith said. It is also not prohibited. Show me the clause that prohibits it. The pause this time was longer. Droll's two forward arms moved slightly. The two folded behind remained in position. Section 14 of the charter specifies that species without faster-than-light travel are classified as pre-emergent and fall under passive observation protocols. Section 14, subsection 3, Orvith said, specifies that the FTL requirement may be waived if the species in question demonstrates technological creativity sufficient to compensate for the limitation. I would argue that successfully decoding a census document in 38 minutes using a translation framework no one told us existed, and then replying via a communication method you were not expecting, meets the threshold for technological creativity. Ivan, she heard later, sat down at that point. His legs had made the decision independently. Droll said nothing for 1 minute and 47 seconds. Orvith counted. Then you have been observing our signals for how long? We have been capable of receiving them for approximately 80 years, Orvith said. We have been decoding them for about 3. I was personally unaware of the census frequency until 36 hours ago. 80 years, Droll said. Oh yes. And in 80 years you said nothing. Nobody told us we were supposed to, Orvith said. There was no instruction packet. There was no welcome letter, nobody knocked. Something in Droll's posture adjusted, not a dramatic change. The 4 eye stalks oriented slightly differently, the forward arms moved again. Orvith had spent enough time working in institutions to recognize the body language of someone who had just been handed a problem significantly larger than their assignment. 6 hours later, Droll emerged from the shuttle with a data pad and the posture of someone who had received information they had not been able to manage. The Assembly, Droll said, has designated Earth as a Category 9 anomaly, pending formal review. What does Category 9 mean? Orvith said. It has not been used in 14,000 years. She considered this. What did it mean 14,000 years ago? Droll said, a world that does not map onto developmental models. Orvith thought about that for a moment. She picked up the notepad. She wrote Category 9, 14,000 years. No current procedural framework. Then she looked up. Good, she said, send us the forms, we'll fill them out. Droll looked at her, really looked, in a way that was different from the processing quality of the initial assessment. Orvith had the sense that, for the first time in the conversation, the figure opposite her was actually seeing what was in front of them rather than what their classification system predicted should be there. Droll left the next morning. The large ship moved away from the station in silence. Orvith and Seleth and Ivan watched it go from the observation deck. Ivan said, was that good or bad? Seleth said nothing. Orvith said, neither. It means they don't have a box for us. And that means we get to decide what the box looks like. 2 weeks later, she was on a supply transit vessel heading for a world whose galactic designation translated, approximately, as the 7th archive installation in the Delta region of Assembly Map territory. The vessel's captain was a broad-framed navigator named Kolben Vrast. He had not asked many questions. He had agreed to the route on the grounds that he had cargo manifests for that destination, and Orvith was technically listed as an academic researcher studying historical records, which was accurate, and the rest was not his department. She had been introduced to Kolben by Uves Thrall, the Pelhari contact assigned to Earth's case after the Category 9 designation. Uves was small, quick-eyed, covered in pale amber fur that shifted slightly with body temperature, and she blinked very rapidly when something interested her. She had made the mistake, during their second communication, of mentioning that she found the whole situation genuinely interesting. Orvith had filed that information under useful and had not acknowledged it directly, because some resources are best not startled. Uves had arranged the passage. The archive world was gray. Gray sky, gray soil, buildings so old they had become part of the landscape through sheer persistence. The underground installation was kilometers of it, shelf after shelf, the accumulated record-keeping of 900,000 years maintained by a species that considered remembering a moral obligation rather than a professional function. The Tessine archivist assigned to her section moved slowly. They always did, Orvith learned, not from physical limitation but from the conviction that things worth moving toward were worth approaching with appropriate consideration. Their name, in translation, resolved to something like one who keeps the count for those who have stopped counting. The translation was approximate. Most things about the Tessin were approximate when rendered in any other language. Most scholars, the archivist said, in a register slightly below normal conversational audibility, spend years before locating anything of particular use. I have 4 days, Orvith said. Where are the passive observation records? Pre-contact classification files. The archivist's eyes moved in a way that might have been surprise, or might have been the Tessin equivalent of a raised eyebrow, or might have been something with no human parallel at all. Orvith was shown to the eastern sublevel. 2 kilometers of shelving, 900,000 years of records on worlds watched, classified, filed away. She found the Sol system files in the 3rd hour. 3 separate files, 3 separate observation periods, 3 different species, none of them current assembly members, absorbed or collapsed or quietly ended in the way that civilizations sometimes quietly ended, had noticed Earth, sent teams, filed detailed reports, and moved on. She opened the first file. 400,000 years ago. The report was 17 pages, clinical, brief. The team had catalogued early humans in small cooperative groups across a warm continent. The language was the language of naturalists describing a moderately interesting weather pattern. Notable characteristic, cooperation rate within non-genetic groups anomalously high. Recommend passive monitoring. No action required. She read it twice. The coffee in her thermos had gone cold before she reached page 4. She did not notice. She was reading the way she read signal data, looking for the thing that did not fit. She closed the first file and opened the second. 160,000 years ago, the report was longer. The language had changed, grown more careful in the specific way of language used by people who were beginning to be unsettled, but did not want to document the unsettlement formally. Cooperation rate remains anomalous. Species demonstrates capacity for persistent knowledge transfer across generations. This is unusual. Recommend continued passive monitoring. Concern noted regarding long-term developmental trajectory. Concern was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Orvith underlined it. She reached for the 3rd file. 11,000 years ago, this report was the longest of the 3. The clinical register was gone entirely. It read like something written by people who had been watching a tide come in for a very long time, and were only now looking at the height marker and understanding the calculation. She read it to the end, then she sat on the cold floor between the shelves. At the bottom of the official report, attached outside its formatting structure, was a personal note. Personal notes were not standard practice in observation reports. This one had been filed anyway and kept because the archive kept everything. She read it once, then she read it again. I have spent 40 years in observation work. I have never filed a note outside the formal structure before. I am aware this is irregular. What concerns me about this species is not what they are capable of. Every projection model we have predicts expansion through organized conflict. Every projection model has been wrong repeatedly, consistently, for the entire duration of this observation period. They have the coordination capacity for territorial dominance. They redirect it toward problems, toward the sky. I do not have a category for this behavior. I am recommending a formal review be commissioned before this species achieves orbital capability. If they reach space before we understand them, we will be standing in territory we have not mapped. The recommendation is dated, the record is accurate, I trust someone will act on it. The review had never been commissioned. Orvith sat on the cold stone floor of the Tessin repository and looked at those words, and then she checked her data chip, and then she ran a search on the file's access log. Because she was a signal analyst and access logs were the kind of detail she checked automatically, the way other people checked whether a door was locked. The note had been accessed most recently 3 years ago by a Meridian Assembly official. 3 years ago was approximately when Earth had begun successfully decoding assembly signal traffic. She checked her own pencil, it was still behind her ear. She pulled out the notepad. She was going to need to write this down carefully, because it was the kind of thing that needed to be written down in something that could not be edited later. This was not an oversight. She sat on the cold floor for a long time. Not because she had nowhere to go. She had a data chip in her pocket and a supply vessel waiting at the surface dock, and a hearing she had not yet been invited to, but intended to attend regardless. She sat because the 11,000-year-old note deserved someone to sit with it for a while. Because the person who wrote it had trusted that someone eventually would, and 11,000 years was a long time to wait for that particular courtesy. The Tessin archivist found her in the 6th hour. She was on her 4th reading. The archivist stood at the end of the shelf row and said nothing, which Orvith was beginning to understand was the Tessine method of asking a question. She looked up. The archivist's eyes moved in the slow, considered way they always moved, taking in the notepad, the data chip in her hand. The 3 files spread open on the floor around her. "Has anyone ever acted on it?" Orvith asked. The archivist said, "The assembly is very old. Old institutions move slowly." Orvith looked at them for a moment. Then she closed the 3rd file. She stood carefully because her legs had gone stiff from the cold stone floor, and the cold had a particular quality in the archive sublevels, the kind that settled into the joints rather than the skin, patient and thorough. "I know," she said, "I used to work for one." She spent the next 2 hours reading further. She had enough, she knew she had enough. The 3 Earth files and the 11,000-year-old note were already more than sufficient for the argument she was building. But she kept reading because the note had said something that she could not stop turning over. They had always feared what we chose not to do. And she wanted to know if that fear was specific to Earth, or if it was a pattern, or if it was something older than that, something baked into the way the assembly related to any world it did not understand. Hundreds of files, worlds watched and classified and filed away. She did not have time to read them all. She read enough. 6 current files. 6 worlds with signal transmission capability, population-scale coordination, technological development that met the assembly's own definitional threshold for sapient classification. All 6 under active passive monitoring. All 6 uncontacted. 3 of them had been transmitting signals into open space for years, not targeted, not structured, not on any particular frequency because nobody had told them what frequency to use. Nobody had knocked on the door. Nobody had told them the door existed. She copied all 6 files onto the data chip. Then she checked the chip was seated correctly in her pocket, patted it once, old habit, always verify a backup before you need it, and she went to find the archivist. "I need to know," she said, "if the access logs for these 6 files show the same pattern as the Earth file." The archivist was quiet for a long moment. Then they said, "I am not able to confirm or deny the contents of access logs for files under active classification review." "I understand," Orvith said. "I will take the silence as informative." She left the archive at dawn. The gray world sky was the same color leaving as it had been arriving, which she found appropriate. Uves Thrall was waiting at the surface transit point, blinking rapidly in the specific Pelhari way that meant she had been doing that since before Orvith appeared and had been suppressing it in the interest of appearing calm. She stopped suppressing it when she saw Orvith's face. She did not ask what Orvith had found. This was the correct call. On Kolben Vrast's supply vessel on the transit back toward assembly station space, Orvith wrote, not a report. Reports had formats and submission protocols and review periods, and this was not going to a review period. What she wrote was closer to a speech which she had never much liked giving. She had spent most of her career in signal work precisely because signal work was about listening. Listening and recording and letting the data make the argument for you. The data was going to make the argument. She was simply going to be in the room. Uves Thrall sat across from her in the crew cabin and did not speak for 4 hours, which Orvith later described as one of the most companionable silences of her professional life. At hour 5, Uves said, "How many?" 6, Orvith said, "That I found there are more." Uves blinked once slowly. "You're going to file secondary petitions. Under Article 2, Clause 14. You've read the whole charter." "I read it on the transit to the archive. I had 41 hours. Uves looked at her for a moment. Then she said in the quick, sideways way she communicated things that mattered, "I may have mentioned the hearing to a few colleagues, academically, as a point of procedural interest." Orvith looked at her. "Several colleagues," Uves said. Kolben Vrast, in the doorway, said he needed to check on something in the cargo hold. He had the expression of someone who had been transporting sensitive materials long enough to know when the manifest had become more interesting than advertised. He went to check on the cargo hold. The Meridian Assembly Station appeared on the transit viewer at hour 18. It was the size of a small geographic feature, a canyon rendered in metal and composite, and the accumulated weight of enough institutional history that architecture had become geology. Orvith looked at it through the viewport for a long time. She was not nervous. She was something else, something she did not have a clean word for. The specific state of a person who has prepared for something so thoroughly that the preparation has exhausted every alternative and left only forward. She adjusted the collar of the gray blazer. It was slightly off. She straightened it. Then she checked the data chip in her pocket. Then she went in. The chamber was already full. She had expected a procedural hearing. Small, administrative, attended by the relevant subcommittee and the block representatives with standing. What she found when she walked through the entry corridor was 28,000 seats, all of them occupied, and a quality of attention in the room that she associated with signal data at its most anomalous. Everything pointed in one direction, waiting. Kolben Vrast was in the upper gallery. He was not supposed to be there. She had no idea how he had obtained a gallery pass. She did not ask. She noted his presence the way she noted useful information, quietly, carefully, without acknowledging it directly. Yves Thrall was in the front observer row. She was blinking very rapidly. Orvith walked to the speaker's platform. She set down her thermos. She placed the notepad on the lectern, opened to the page with the clause numbers. She seated the data chip in the display port. The Varethi founding compact block table was at the chamber's primary response position, 14 species arranged in seniority order, first coordinator Osuvith Dral at the center. Dral was approximately 2.3 meters tall, pale gray-green exoskeletal plating, 4 eye stalks currently all oriented toward Orvith. The ceremonial sash indicated 400 years of unbroken block seniority. The secondary mandibles were still. Before Orvith could speak, the Varethi block filed a procedural motion to table the petition indefinitely, pending developmental review. She had expected this. Before the chamber considers that motion, she said, I am entering archive evidence under Foundation Charter Article 7, Clause 3, the right of any party withstanding to present verified historical record prior to procedural vote. I am invoking this clause before the motion is seconded. The chamber's evidence rules were clear. The motion could not proceed until the evidence presentation was complete. The Varethi block attempted to cut the chamber display feed. The charter's own evidence rules held. They tried twice more. Both times the rules held. Orvith watched the attempts with the flat attention she gave to all data that confirmed a hypothesis. She activated the display port. 400,000 years of Earth observation files appeared on every screen in the chamber simultaneously. The room went very quiet. She let the files run, all 3. The clinical 17-page brief from 400,000 years ago, the careful hedged language of 160,000 years ago, the broken formality of 11,000 years ago, the clinical register gone, the pressure visible in every paragraph. And then, attached outside the official formatting, the personal note, translated clean, in the Assembly's own primary communication language on every screen. 28,000 people read the words of a scientist 11,000 years dead. I am recommending a formal review be commissioned before this species achieves orbital capability. I trust someone will act on it. Nobody moved. Orvith let the silence run for 12 seconds, she counted. Then she presented her submission in 3 parts. First, Earth had been assessed by 3 independent observation teams as displaying charter-defined sapient indicators. The most recent assessment had explicitly recommended formal review 11,000 years ago. That review had never been commissioned. The file had been accessed most recently 3 years prior, the same year Earth began decoding assembly signal traffic. This was not an oversight. The record was accurate. The record showed a decision. Second, Article 2, Clause 9 established communication capability as the threshold for sapient classification review, not propulsion capability. Earth had initiated structured communication on a designated frequency. Earth had decoded an assembly census document in 38 minutes using a self-developed translation framework. Earth had replied, using a communication method not listed in the charter as either authorized or prohibited. The threshold had been crossed. Third, Earth's unintended transmissions had been detectable in 34 assembly map systems for 87 years. Humanity did not need to arrive. It was already there. The question before the chamber was not whether the assembly would permit Earth entry. The door, she said, was not theirs to keep closed. A 40-minute recess was called. Orvith sat down. She counted her breaths. 7, 12, 19. Yves Thrall was beside her, saying nothing, which was the correct thing to do and which Orvith appreciated more than she would have been able to articulate. Across the chamber, the Varethi block was in visible consultation, arms moving, eye stalks conferring, the quality of a group that has just discovered that the room they built does not lock from the inside. She did not look away from Osuvith Dral when Dral glanced in her direction. She counted 1, 2, 3. Dral looked away first. The session resumed. The tabling motion was withdrawn. A sound moved through 28,000 people that was not applause and was not a gasp. It was something releasing, a pressure that had been building since the files appeared on the screens, finally finding the exit it had been looking for. The chamber did not erupt. It equalized. There was a difference, and Orvith noted it in the way she noted everything, precisely, without embellishment. The vote was called. She did not count the seconds this time. She counted the votes. 206 in favor, 8 opposed. Earth was granted observer status in the Meridian Assembly, effective immediately, subject to the standard observation period provisions of Article 3. And then Orvith raised her hand. The first voice recognized her. She stood. Under Article 2, Clause 14, she said, observer nations that achieved status on the basis of unjust classification may simultaneously petition on behalf of other worlds believed to be similarly misclassified. I am filing 6 secondary petitions. I have the documentation. The chamber went quiet a second time. It was different from the first quiet. The first had been the silence of something being confirmed. This was the silence of something being understood, the slow, distributed recognition that the hearing was not concluding. It was expanding. She activated the data chip again. 6 worlds on every screen, live monitoring feeds, going about the ordinary business of existing without knowing they were being watched. 3 of them, Orvith noted aloud, had been transmitting signals for years. Into the dark, without knowing what frequency to use, without knowing there was a frequency or that there was anyone who might receive it. Nobody told them, she said. I have found this to be the last administrative oversight I intend to allow. First Coordinator Asuvith Dral rose. The secondary mandibles had been clicking since the archive footage first appeared on the screens, steady and rhythmic, a sound that had been present for the entire 6-hour session the way background noise was present, noticed once and then absorbed, part of the room's texture. The clicking had become, without Orvith consciously registering it, a kind of counter, a measure of something being managed. Dral rose to full height. 4 eye stalks oriented toward the speaker's platform. You do not understand, said Dral, in the gravel register of someone who had spent 400 years unaccustomed to being in this position, the complexity of what you are proposing. Orvith looked at Dral across the chamber floor. 28,000 witnesses, the archive footage still on every display, the 6 worlds live going about their days. She thought about a cold archive floor. She thought about 11,000 years of correct documentation and deliberate inaction. She thought about the Tessane archivist, who had kept the count for 900,000 years and had watched every entry stay filed. She counted to 9. With respect, she said, I think we understand it very well. 1 breath. Better than you would prefer. 9 seconds of silence. She counted those too. The first block member rose from the Varethi table. She did not speak. She lifted both forward arms and folded the ceremonial sash across the secondary set in a motion that was slow, deliberate, and clearly formal. A signal, Orvith would learn later, that indicated withdrawal of chamber participation. Then she turned and walked toward the exit corridor. Her footsteps were audible. Not because they were loud. Because the room had expanded around them, the way a room expands when something has been removed from it. A sound, a pressure, a presence that had been shaping the acoustics without anyone registering it. The footsteps were simply present in a silence that had grown to accommodate them. The second block member stood before the first had cleared the door. No words, no acknowledgement of the first voice's recognition signal, the same folded sash, the same exit. The third stood. She looked once across the chamber, not at Orvith, not at the first voice, not at the galleries, at Asuvith Dral, a look that had the quality of something being transferred or surrendered or simply acknowledged. Then she followed. Asuvith Dral did not move. The clicking of the secondary mandibles had stopped. Not gradually, not trailing off. Simply absent, the space where it had been a counter now returning to ordinary silence, and the ordinary silence somehow louder for it. Dral stood at full height and was still, and the stillness had a different quality than the stillness of the chamber. The chamber had settled and Dral had not. 28,000 individuals processed something simultaneously. The sound of it was not dramatic. It was the sound of a very large room returning to its baseline pressure after something has changed inside it. Distributed, quiet, real. Orvith was still at the speaker's platform. She had not moved since delivering the secondary petitions. The thermos was in her hand, coffee cold for the past 2 hours. She had not noticed until now. The notepad was open on the lectern in front of her, the page with the clause numbers, the silence durations, the archivist's non-denial logged in the 3rd line. Uves Thral in the front row, blinking rapidly. Kolben Vrast in the gallery, giving her a single small nod from a height that suggested he had found a better vantage point than the seat his pass had assigned him. She closed the notepad. She stepped back from the platform. She sat down in the observer row beside Uves Thral and she opened the notepad again and she wrote, 6 hours, 41 minutes, 28,000 witnesses, 3 departures, 206 in favor, 8 opposed, 6 secondary petitions filed and ruled admissible. She did not write what she had said to the first coordinator. She did not need to, it was already on every chamber's transcript. She had counted the silence that followed it, 9 seconds, some answers did not need to be recorded. They were already on the records. The first voice's voice, carrying clearly to the back row without amplification, called the next item on the assembly's agenda. The chamber settled into it. Ordinary business, the procedural rhythm of an institution old enough to have made routine out of everything. As though the previous 6 hours and 41 minutes were already being processed, filed, archived, absorbed into the 900,000-year record of things that had happened here and been noted and survived. 3 of the 6 secondary petitions were scheduled for preliminary hearings within the month, the other 3 within the quarter. Orvith sat and listened to the first voice work through the next agenda item and thought, good. The transport back to Castle left the following morning. Uves Thrall sat across from her in the crew cabin and did not speak for 4 hours. This was, as Orvith considered it, one of the most companionable silences of her professional life. Not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. The silence of someone who understood that the thing that had just happened was large enough to require that kind of room. At hour 5, Uves said, he's going to file procedural challenges to the secondary petitions. Yes, Orvith said. All 6. Probably. It will take years. Yes, Orvith said, that's fine, we have the receipts. Kolben Vrast, from the pilot compartment, announced that he was considering retiring after this run. His voice had the specific quality of someone announcing something they have no intention of following through on. He made 3 more supply runs to assembly station space over the following year. In the week after the hearing, the first voice dissolved 200 quarantine files using a charter provision allowing unilateral dissolution when a quarantine had been established on procedurally deficient documentation. Not all 200 would lead to recognition hearings. Not all those worlds were at a point where contact was appropriate. The classifications were complex. The histories were long. But 200 entries that had said, in the flat bureaucratic language of careful institutional management, this world is not worth noticing. Those entries were simply gone. Orvith thought about that for a long time on the transport, not with triumph. With something quieter than that, something she turned over carefully before she was able to name it. Relief maybe that someone had gone to look, that the note had not simply stayed filed. Castle Station smelled like industrious mildew when she returned. She had been gone 11 days. It smelled exactly the same as when she left, which was correct, because Castle Station did not update itself while she was away. Some environments were reliable in that way. Selath Orn met her at the docking corridor. He mentioned, completed a second transmitter upgrade while she was gone. It was somewhat larger than the first, and somewhat larger than the station manifest had technically authorized. And he was mildly apologetic about this in the specific way of people who considered the apology a courtesy rather than a genuine expression of remorse. She looked at the new transmitter. It was, she estimated, capable of reaching 14 additional systems. Good, she said. Ivan Brawl said nothing when she arrived. There was a thermos of coffee on her console, fresh, which was not a third morning delivery. It was a daily delivery now. This was Ivan's way of noting that the scale of things had changed without having to say so directly. The crew did not debrief formally. There was no meeting, no review, no structured conversation about what had occurred. They simply resumed. The monitoring sweeps ran. The diagnostic cycles ran. Selath ran manual checks on equipment that did not need manual checks because that was what Selath did when he was processing something and wanted something to do with his hands. Orvith sat at her console and opened the monitoring queue. 6 new threads, all flagged, first contact pending, observation lifted. She looked at the first thread. Static, she filtered it. Pattern emerged from the static, irregular but present, the grammar of something not random, something with intention beneath the noise, something that had been speaking into the dark for years without knowing if the dark was occupied. She pulled out the notepad, 30 pages left. She looked at the pencil behind her ear. It had been there since before this started. Since the paper nobody read, since the frequency she had added to the sweep for theoretical reasons. Since the 11 seconds she had counted twice in a cold signal bay at 4 in the morning when the stars were in the viewport, and the coffee was cold and the array had pinged once quietly on a channel nobody was supposed to be using. She put the pencil to the page. Outside the viewport, the stars held their positions, patient and exact, 6 of them a little less unreachable than they had been 11 days ago.